Hi there and welcome. This is class number 29. It's Monday, the 9th of November 2015. I'm away at a conference today, so I thought I'll record this lecture for you as a YouTube video. So you can watch this and listen to my explanations on a computer, on your smartphone, on whatever you have. So please be aware that the wind worksheet number 2 is due today. Just dropped it off in my mailbox. The homework assignment number 5 answers, they are already linked online, and practice test number 3 and answers are also already available online. So no class, of course, on Wednesday because of Veterans Day, and then we'll meet again on Friday for our third test. So this class is called Review and Discussion. And here's our 5 topics. We want to think about big picture issues here. First of all, seasons and climate zones. Then we'll talk about the horizontal, or also called latitudinal energy imbalance. Then the vertical energy imbalance. Then we'll talk about wind. And then finally, big picture about the greenhouse effect. So that's what we're going to try to do here in this class. So let's jump right in. Big picture number 1, seasons and climate zones. Okay, that link there you can click on, and that links you back to that video of the Harvard students being asked what causes the seasons. And we of course know the basic story. We know seasons are not caused by the Earth being closer or farther away from the sun, but here the concept map does a really nice job at explaining what causes the seasons. So we've covered that, I think, pretty well. Tilted orbit of the spherical Earth around the sun, right? That impacts the sun angle. The sun angle in turn impacts atmospheric obstruction. And then we also have the effect on the length of the day. And then finally we have that figure here in the lower right corner that I handed out, that we did a whole exercise on, which I call the most important figure in all of climatology. And this figure really shows you climate zones and seasons on the planet. We played around with this, we dissected this graph, we drew sketch graphs, right? So we start at the equator, for example, no seasons. Why are there no seasons at the equator? Well, because the amount of energy reaching the equator from the sun pretty much stays the same all year round. Therefore, the temperature of the equator all stays the same all year round. In contrast, if you take New York City or Massachusetts, if you take the mid-latitudes, we have strong seasons. Why is that? Because we get a lot of heat from the sun May, June, July, and August, and we don't get a lot of heat from the sun January, February, November, December. So we have an annual cycle in energy from the sun. Therefore, we have an annual cycle in temperature. And then most extreme, we have extreme seasons at the North Pole and at the South Pole. Here we have the basic climate zones of the planet. We talked about this. We have the tropics. Then we have the mid-latitudes of both hemispheres, right? So mid-latitudes in the northern hemisphere, that'd be the United States, it would be Europe, parts of China, parts of Russia, certainly. And of course, we also have the mid-latitudes of the southern hemisphere. And here you can think Australia, you can think South Africa. And then, of course, you have the polar regions of the world, both the Arctic in the northern hemisphere and the Antarctic in the southern hemisphere. Now, the second part here is, big picture number 2, is what I refer to as the horizontal energy imbalance. You can also call it the latitudinal energy imbalance. And the basic story is written up in that gray box. There's a surplus of heat, surplus of energy, if you will, in the tropical regions. And there's a deficit of energy and heat in the mid-latitudes and the polar regions. So that's what we refer to as the energy imbalance as a function of latitude. That's an unstable situation, and nature has to somehow balance that out. Why do we have that imbalance? Again, that's all related to the tilted orbit of the spherical Earth around the sun. And here we have a chart we looked at. In red, we have the outgoing long-wave electromagnetic radiation from the Earth. That's 1. And then in yellow, we have how much energy the Earth receives from the sun. And then you can see in parts of the Earth, in the tropical parts of the Earth, there's a surplus. There's more energy coming in than energy going out. And matching that in the northern hemisphere and in the southern hemisphere, we have areas of deficit where there's more energy being lost than energy being gained. So this can't really be. This is an imbalance. This doesn't work in nature. This doesn't satisfy the basic laws of physics. So now we have to get rid of this energy. Right? Sure, we can't have a situation where we're only gaining heat or where we're gaining too much heat in the tropics and not really in the polar regions. And then the red curve, of course, the Earth losing more energy in the tropical, in the tropics and the mid-latitudes and in the polar regions because of temperature differences. So that doesn't work. We now have to somehow solve this problem, here illustrated as a map. So here in red are the parts of the planet that overall have a surplus of energy. So those are positive values. And then in blue, we have parts of the Earth where there's overall a deficit of energy. And then the whites are sort of where things are about even. And again, as we talked about, this is not feasible in the long run, because what that would mean is that the tropics would get hotter and hotter and hotter, and the mid-latitudes and the polar regions would get colder and colder and colder, and this wouldn't work. You have to have some energy transport mechanism that's sort of schematically shown here by those white arrows, where somehow heat has to be moved from the areas of red, from the tropics, into the areas of blue. It has to be moved from areas of surplus to areas of deficit. And we move heat by moving warm air and warm water. So fundamentally, what we have here is the reason for wind and ocean currents. Now, the vertical energy imbalance. This is this idea of having a boiling water, if you will, putting a pot of water over a hot burner. And that's, of course, pretty much how it works in the atmosphere. The atmosphere is heated from the Earth's surface. So the sun doesn't heat the air. The sun heats the surface of the Earth, and that hot surface heats the cold atmosphere. So therefore, it gets colder the higher you go in the atmosphere. The farther you are away from the surface of the Earth, which is the heat source, the colder it gets. And that's, of course, exactly what happens on your stove when you make a cup of tea. Right? Same thing, you have something cold, your water, or something hot, your burner. And what does happen now? You see it in that glass pot there. You have convection, you have vertical mixing. You have bubbles that are forming at the bottom of your pot, rising up to the top of your pot. And the same thing, the same bubbles are rising in the atmosphere. Schematically, right? So you might have a situation like this where you have a road, a paved road, asphalt, right? And that road is surrounded by grassland, by beautiful lush grass. And so we all know when the sun is out, the tarmac gets hot. And so now warm air rises above the asphalt. The same way up in that upper right corner, you get convection, you get vertical mixing in your pot as the water that's being heated at the bottom by the flame rises to the surface of your water inside your pot. The same thing happens here. And then the air spreads out and sinks back down as it cools and then moves inward. So you have what's called a convection cell. And those convection cells that you can observe happening in your saucepan when you boil water for food, the same convection cells, just at different scales, occur in the atmosphere. Between roads and surrounding grassland, between cities and surrounding suburbs, between mountains and valleys, between land, between ocean, and at the global scale, it happens between the equator and the polar regions. So now we're trying to solve or balance out that vertical energy imbalance by making air rise in the atmosphere, because somehow we have to do that, right? The surface of the Earth is too hot versus the higher parts of the atmosphere are too cold, so we have to transfer heat from the surface of the Earth to the higher parts of the atmosphere. And we will look into this in detail in the last quarter of this course, but if you kind of imagine a bubble of air that's rising, right, it's sort of shown there in that diagram on the left. So our bubble of air is heated at the Earth's surface. It rises up in the atmosphere, the same way your bubble of hot water rises in your stove. Now, and again, we'll look at the details. As that bubble rises, it expands. As it expands, it cools. That's one of those laws of physics. As it cools, it becomes saturated with moisture. You get condensation, and our air bubble condenses into a cloud. And then, if that continues, that cloud starts to produce rain or snow. So anytime you see a cloud in the sky, you see this process. You see the process of the vertical heat imbalance in the atmosphere. You see a bubble, if you will, that was heated at the surface of the Earth, that has risen in the atmosphere to the point where it got saturated and condensation occurred. But again, that stuff we'll cover in detail in the last part of this. Big picture wind. Here's an awesome link I suggest you click on. A fantastic little video about wind. Next slide. Right, it all starts with a pressure map. It all starts with a basic weather map. And when you look at the weather map, this happens to be from the one from the Weather Channel. You really see a few really important things that help us figure out what's going on. Right, we see differences in air pressure. We see highs, blue H's, we see lows, red L's, and we see, in this case, also our isobars, our changes in air pressure. If we have differences in air pressure, we get wind. And wind brings us weather and climate. So that's the basic connection here. Here's our little cheat sheet. We developed that in class on Friday. When you talk wind, when you are interested in predicting wind speed and wind direction, you always have to say, okay, are we dealing with the upper atmosphere or are we dealing with the lower atmosphere? Because that determines whether you deal with 3 forces or with 2 forces. So we have the upper atmosphere, we have only 2 forces, right? We have the pressure gradient force, we have the Coriolis force that's deflecting that, and then the winds have to blow parallel to the isobars. We call that a geostrophic wind. In the upper atmosphere, winds cannot blow diagonally across isobars. In the lower atmosphere, the story is different, because sure, we have a pressure gradient force, sure, we have Coriolis, but we also have friction. The Earth's surface is bumpy. The Earth's surface slows down the wind. Therefore, the Coriolis force is less, and the winds blow across isobars at an angle. They never blow parallel to the isobars. Wind speed is always a function of pressure gradient. The greater the pressure gradient, the faster the wind. In the lower atmosphere, in addition to that, the amount of friction plays a role. So if you're out in the ocean where there's hardly any friction, wind speeds are pretty high. If you're on land where there's trees in the way and houses in the way and hills in the way and mountains in the way, the wind gets slowed down a bit. And then, to make the story really interesting, it turns out that we have these large, big, semi-permanent high pressure and low pressure areas on the planet. Right? So there are simply parts of the Earth that are always high pressure and always low pressure. Now, always here means climatically. It might be different on any given day, right? Weather is always a little bit different. But on average, as you can see here, there's always low pressure near the equator. There's always high pressure in the subtropics. Think Sahara, think Mexico. and there's always low pressure kind of over Canada. And therefore, we have predictable large-scale pressure patterns. Therefore, we have predictable large-scale atmospheric circulation patterns. In other words, wind patterns on the planet. And we'll get into those details in the last quarter of the course. The greenhouse effect, here's another awesome link you can explore. The greenhouse effect and issues of global warming. We talked about it. We want to really distinguish between the natural greenhouse effect and the human-caused greenhouse effect. So the total greenhouse effect is now a combination of natural causes and human causes. And we talked about the idea that the natural greenhouse effect is kind of nice because it keeps the Earth at a nice livable temperature. The human greenhouse effect is in addition to that, mainly because humans have burned fossil fuels, which adds carbon dioxide, methane, and other greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. So we're enhancing the greenhouse effect, and that's like putting the Earth into a thick sleeping bag, and it just gets too hot, and all of that really has been known for over 100 years. Basic laws of physics. So this ends our little review and discussion lecture. Once again, we've covered seasons and climate zones. We've covered the horizontal or latitudinal energy imbalance. We talked about the vertical energy imbalance. We said something about wind and then briefly about the greenhouse effect. No class, of course, on Wednesday. We will see you again on Friday for the third test. What you find online is, first of all, the answers for homework 5. You will also find the third practice test, and you also will find the answers to that. And what I like you to do is complete the worksheet, the worksheet number 2, and deliver it to my mailbox in Wilson 203 today. So thank you very much, and have a nice week. We see you on Friday.